Pathologic has been a weird beast of a video game franchise for me when it comes to making YouTube content. Literally for years now, I've been wanting to make a big video essay on the game to take it apart and share the myriad of thoughts that I have on it with you. I've made this 45-minute long video on The Void a while back, the other big title by the same developer, Pathologic, and this one was already a juggernaut to research, write, and produce. And the result ended up being a video that only covered about maybe 20% of what I could have said and gone into about the game at the time, and this amount has already increased since then. And I always knew that Pathologic would be an even grander task to tackle in a video. Now, technically I've already made a video about it, but it was a short commentary a good while back that I released exclusively for my patrons that was titled Why You Should Play Pathologic, in which I, without any big script or anything, try to get across what makes this game so worth playing, and that I was planning to make a video on it at the time. I projected that it would take a couple of months, but, well...
It never happened.
Not for lack of trying, though. By now, I've attempted to write a video essay on Pathologic multiple times, and I've tossed far over 10,000 words of written script into the bin because I always ended up being unhappy with the direction, approach, and just everything. It just never felt right. Which I think tells you a good bit about what kind of game Pathologic is. It's, in my opinion, one of the most brilliant video games ever made, but it's also a very strange one, a tough one to approach and decipher and chew on, because it really needs some dedication to get into the game's very unique mindset. But hey, in May this year, after several years of development, 15 years after the original Pathologic was first released, Pathologic blessed us with the quote-unquote sequel, Pathologic 2. I've been following the game's development quite closely, backed it on Kickstarter, played the standalone Marvel's Nest demo in 2017, played several versions of the alpha and the beta, and even participated in the closed beta QA tests before launch. And ever since the game released in the final version, I've spent a lot of time with it. And what can I say? Pathologic 2, luckily, turned out to become one of the best video games I've ever played in my entire life. And in this video, I want to give you a mostly spoiler-free rundown of why this game is so genius in my eyes and why you should absolutely play it. I still intend to work on an exploration of the game's story, themes, lore, symbolism, and all that. But until that happens, this video is my attempt at convincing you that this game is worth playing, and that the developers should be supported so they stay in business. Sales for Pathologic 2 weren't exactly in the regions of a Red Dead Redemption 2, as you can imagine, and Pathologic has reportedly been financially struggling because Pathologic 2 didn't get the attention it damn well deserves. And I want them to be able to eventually finalize their vision of the plague-ridden step town. So let's start with the big elephant in the room question that people repeatedly ask about Pathologic 2. Do I have to have played the first game? No, you don't. In many ways, I actually envy you for not having played Pathologic 1 yet, because your experience starting the game without knowing what's going on in this town in which everything takes place through the lens of the first game will be fundamentally different and maybe in some ways even better. But if you're worried that you're missing out on previous story elements that are necessary to understand what's going on, consider Pathologic 2 to be a remake, a reimagining of the first game's story. The events depicted in Pathologic 2 are exactly the same incident as the one in the first one. A deadly pandemic infesting this town far out in the steppe, with you taking on the role of a doctor who just so happens to be in town at the time. But it doesn't just overwrite, retcon the narrative of the first game and do it again. The first game happened. It's being acknowledged in Pathologic 2 on several occasions, but you're also starting the events, the actual same events of that incident over from the start. The whole thing is framed as being a stage play in which you take on the role of one of its central or supporting actors, and the play played out in the first game, and now you play it again because it came to a certain conclusion and you want to see if you get to a different conclusion. The game is quite meta in its presentation, more on that later. Yeah. The first game is also far, far harder to approach. It already felt clunky and hard to play back when it was released, and in hindsight, it is a tough beast to tame. Its gameplay often feels wonky, and its systems are quite opaque, and getting into the rhythm in which the game presents its story requires a massive amount of suspension of disbelief, especially from a modern point of view, that needs a lot of effort to put in to build it up. It is a fantastic game, don't get me wrong, but it's also a title that's very hard to approach, especially from a modern player's perspective, someone who is, spoiled by the development of video game design in the last 15 years. So if you tell yourself, oh hey, I'm gonna quickly finish Pathologic 1 before I get to play 2, you might end up finding yourself in a dead end. I can just tell you that it personally took me years and several new approaches with lots of pauses in between to even finish the first playthrough of the game. And yeah, there's 3 different characters from whose viewpoints you experience the events of the game, and each one is essential to the game's story, and each one takes many, many hours to complete. Also, the translation of the first game from Russian to English was notoriously bad, which got in good parts highly improved in the re-released version called Pathologic Classic HD, which is the version of the game I would recommend if you're interested in checking it out. But the translation of Pathologic 2 in this case is fantastic, and it features some excellently written prose, dialogue with so much nuance that it really makes it worth reading all the dialogue very, very keenly and carefully. It is so well written that you can reliably hear what a character thinks of you or other characters or events that have taken place they're talking about, from subtleties in their speech that's often really meant to go over your head, especially as a new player who isn't really in on everything, to make you feel like you are just one part of the whole equation and not the central character to whom everything is catered. And yeah, all these things were elements that made the first also great, but this time the English translation is simply fantastic. So, starting with 2, you will begin the story from scratch, just as you would if you started out with the first game. But I must say, in many ways I find the exposition, the way the story is presented to you and the way you as the player are led through it, to be crafted more efficiently than in the first one. It's probably one of the most original, surreal, trippy and mind-bending tutorials I've ever played that doesn't even really fully feel like a tutorial. It's such a great narrative build-up as well as an introduction to the game's basic mechanics and themes in a playful way. It really works. I'm not going to go into detail as to why exactly I think that is, because that would spoil key elements of the game, but let me just say that Pathologic 2 features one of the most brilliant uses of the in medias res trope I've ever seen in a video game, or in any story for that matter. In medias res, that's a story that begins its first chapter somewhere at the height of the action, where things are really going down, only to then rewind back to the beginning before everything unfolded. It's often used to give the audience a glimpse of what's to expect, to not bore people to death by slow build-up and everything. But oftentimes I find this trope a little bit annoying, because it seems to assume that I, as the audience, don't have the patience to stand through long phases of build-up. But I kind of love that kind of storytelling. Anyway, in Pathologic 2, the opening is done so mind-blowingly clever. It at first feels quite on the nose, but it gets quickly across that this game tells its story very indirectly and through several layers of narrative obfuscation, if you will, that it constantly makes you question whether what's depicted is a metaphor, or literal, or somewhere in between, or somewhere far off. Uncertainty is the natural state in this game, not just narratively, but also gameplay-wise. And it also strongly foreshadows the futility of your own actions within this cataclysmic incident. And that is one of the game's central themes. Now, Pathologic 2, as I mentioned, plays out in a remote city far out in steppe, in an undefined industrial age time period that gets doomed by a highly infectious and deadly disease. The city is governed by 3 influential families, or rather factions, with different leading ideologies: humility, utopianism, and preservation, who will come into conflict with each other over the course of the story. and you take on the role of Atemi Burach, son of the town's Dr. Isidor Burach, and a surgeon who returns from his not entirely successful medical studies in the capital, and who has a connection to the traditional indigenous stepways of healing. You are one of the few people in this town with a semblance of professional medical knowledge, so your blood-tainted hands will likely become an invaluable asset during this outbreak. The events of the game are separated in days, and that's an important factor. Time passes continuously. The whole event plays out in real time. Every day goes from, surprise, midnight to midnight. But the things that happen in this town take place no matter if you're there or not. This is not a game that waits for the protagonist to show up. If you're not there, the plague, as well as the cadre of characters involved, won't wait for you. And everything will end in exactly 12 days. So make good use of your time. Think about what you want to do and which activities are a waste of your time, and don't sleep the days away. Time is a central currency in Pathologic 2. The town is built in an open world fashion, where you can technically enter every single house, which is not always legal, and town folks generally don't like you a lot for breaking into their places and robbing them. And you will interact and talk with key figures during the outbreak. I mean, you almost interact with the entire town. You can talk with anybody and barter with anybody. It really tries to not put any constraints to what you can and can't do. Your actions will possibly save or condemn lives, and your choices will ideally determine, or rather influence, steer the path this outbreak might take. Mechanically, at its core, the game has a strong survival aspect. Everything is about survival, really. Your survival, the town's survival, the families and factions' survival, its inhabitants, and you constantly struggle with your own hunger, thirst, and fatigue. So you have to scavenge everything you find, including trash bins. I'm sure there's some symbolism in that to find as well. And barter with pretty much everyone in the streets, including the children, who are not as helpless as you might think, and who play a very important role in the whole conundrum. The town really has its very own economy. Prices undergo massive inflation because during a deadly plague, suddenly money becomes pretty worthless. So most of the time, you're going to find yourself trading items that people want rather than paying them with cash money. And figuring out how trading with the townsfolk works, which prices are reasonable and which ones are cutthroat, and who to trade with to get you what you want, is a central part of learning how this game actually works and how to get ahead in the story and how to, stay afloat. It's quite clever, really. And let me clarify that. I personally are not really a big fan of survival games per se. I've got nothing against the genre. It's one that I respect, and I completely see and understand its appeal. But it's just not my taste. It's not something that I personally seek out for myself to play for enjoyment. But Pathologic 2 is mechanically a survival game through and through, and a rather tough one at that. But with this game, it surprisingly works for me. And a big part of that is that the whole experience so perfectly interlocks all of its elements within the game's metaphor. That with this game, I don't just tolerate the survival aspects, they actually captivate me. Playing the game for several hours and going to bed after, I'll guaranteed spend the night planning and strategizing in my sleep and waking up eager to get back into it. Even though, or no, in many ways even because, it is very unforgiving. It is a true challenge, but is an interesting challenge. Now let's not beat around the bush for too long and talk about difficulty, because this is where it gets juicy. Pathologic 2 is a game that is not meant to empower you. And it is a game that is very often not fun, at least not in the traditional sense. But if it's played the way it's meant to be played, then Pathologic 2 will stress you out and make you truly feel like you're just barely surviving, barely getting by, while already frantically trying your best. This is how you're meant to feel. And there is a point to all of this. This is one of the key aspects of what makes this game such an incomparable experience, honestly, like nothing I've ever played before, comparing to the first Pathologic, because the way it's realized in the second one is so much more refined and so much more on point to get this across that it actually quite surprised me when the game was finally released. And I'm firm about this. The intended experience works a lot better than it did in the original even. There are several key changes in the game's design that firmly drive this home. The closest comparison that I can draw with other games to this is, for example, This War of Mine, a game where you take charge of a group of survivors in a war zone that constantly and through gameplay instead of scripted events forces you to make tough, often unpopular and harsh decisions for the survival of your group. Or Frostpunk, by the same developer, which is a game that, when you're doing everything right and are winning, is a neat town builder at best. But if you start getting in trouble and running low on resources and, doing things wrong, making mistakes, this is when the game really starts to shine, because it plays with harsh decisions and their consequences in the face of death and starvation. Pathologic 2 drives on the same tracks, and it is phenomenal at this theme. But we are all extremely used and conditioned to empowerment in video games. When we hear, "In this game, you play a doctor during the outbreak of a plague," we intuitively expect us to be the hero in the end. Sure, there's going to be hardships, but we're used to be the one who saves the day in the end and who defeats the plague and will be honored for their great efforts, etc., etc. And Pathologic 2, it's kind of a spoiler, but it does not do that. It quickly suffocates this notion that you're sent in to save the day, because after 2 to 3 days already, you'll find yourself struggling with your resources so much that you'll end up having to abandon quest lines that you actually found interesting and having to abandon people that you wanted to save simply because you don't have enough time to get everything done and save your own hide. Will you run across the entire map to sell these organs you're carrying around to the guy who buys them for a good price? Because it is going to give you a lot of valuable resources for it that you dearly need, but you will also find yourself super exhausted and hungry when you arrive, and you've also wasted a lot of time. Or will you maybe pay the boatman to carry you half across town to pay for it? But that's expensive. It's a constant struggle, and you constantly have to evaluate what actions will cost you. And there are more currencies than just money. If we extend the idea of currencies like certain objects and their usefulness, time, fatigue, all that kind of stuff, all this is currencies that you intuitively have to consider for each action you take. And even though in the first days the game is already showing its teeth, it gets a lot tougher over time. There is a plague that's breaking out, and it's getting worse and worse over time despite your best efforts. I'm trying not to go into too much detail because discovering what happens is a crucial part of the game and super interesting and oftentimes really jaw-dropping. Also in its presentation, the game is freaking beautiful. I'm really impressed by how well they pull this all off, visually and graphically and aesthetically. This is just... But yeah, I'm digressing. A lot of people were thrown off by the steep difficulty of Pathologic 2, so much so that the developers added difficulty sliders in a later patch, which you can adjust values like how fast you get hungry, fatigued, how much damage you do and take, and how expensive items are. You can really customize the game a lot with this, but I want to try and, for now, plead to you to leave them untouched during your first playthrough, even though I can guarantee you that by that the game will be incredibly tough. Pathologic 2 is trying to be far more realistic in how it plays out consequences, without catering to power fantasies. I've seen a lot of people complain oh my god, I got infected, and then I tried to heal myself with antibiotics, and they're incredibly expensive, but it almost did nothing. This game is broken. Which, really, I get why we feel this. I get why we feel this game is broken because of that, because when you compare it with other games, usually for you, the player character around whom the narrative is spun, for whom everything is built, there's often a different set of rules by which something like a deadly plague operates, because you don't want to throw the player off, and the player has to be the savior in the end, right? So we have to build in some safety mechanics in there so that the player doesn't get tossed off a cliff like every other unimportant side character, But hey, seriously, think about it. You just got infected by one of the most deadly plagues in existence. What do you expect? Take a short vodka to cure radiation? Nope. Pathologic 2 really makes it clear that you've literally just been infected by one of the most deadly plagues in existence. Deal with it. Or, don't, and just die. If you were to contract the, say, Spanish plague in real life, well, I've got bad news for you. You'd be just as fucked. But, well, while your next days after, contracting the infection would certainly not be pleasant, they'd sure as hell be an extraordinary experience, wouldn't they? And yeah, without wanting to spoil anything, getting infected in Pathologic 2, it sucks, but it also leads to some damn interesting experiences, twists and turns. This is what it's about. Embrace your mistakes. Think about this. If you're a tabletop RPG player, you probably know full well that when you have a good storyteller or DM, rolling a critical failure often leads to the most interesting role-playing experiences. Sure, frustration goes along with it, but it's also extraordinary. In video games, death is very often treated as a state of, well, you failed, so you better reload and try again, because that is not how the story played out. Let's do it right this time. But Pathologic 2 is one of those games where you have an exceptional DM. Death, or more precisely failure, leads to the most interesting experience. And let me tell you this, death is not the end in this game.
When you're sad and when you're lonely and you haven't got a friend, just remember that death is not the end.
If you play through these entire 12 days, quote-unquote, flawlessly, you will end up with a far less interesting experience than if you ended up teeth-grindingly fighting for survival, trying to save people from dying at a hair's breadth, only to get infected yourself by the plague and finding out that you've nearly been doomed to death, that trying to get rid of your infection is so costly and extremely frustratingly inefficient, and then finding that you sacrificed your last antibiotics that didn't even do shit to keep yourself alive for just a bit longer, which made you ultimately unable to save another infected person that dies because of your choices. But that also includes the other side of this coin, because if you know that your choices truly matter and can truly, pull you deep down, then doing the right choices and succeeding is so much more rewarding, because it doesn't feel like the game just leads you to the path of success on rails, but it really feels like you understood the systems and the city and what's happening, and you understood what was going on, and because you read it correctly and you took the right turns, you succeeded and you helped someone genuinely. It's one of the best examples of narrative effort justification that I've ever played. If you end up breaking into houses because you're so hungry and can't find or barter food anywhere to get you through the day, and it gets critically close, and then during that break-in you accidentally end up killing some harmless, innocent person in self-defense while you were trying to scavenge their possessions, it puts you in these impossible situations, and all these choices the game notices and remembers and takes into account. Without a generic Clementine will remember this. And let me say that again, death is not the end. That is very important in considering how to approach this game, because you usually try to avoid dying in a game, so much so that we, save spam or go back to an older save if we know, we might not be able to do it. But trust me, play it out. Even if it gets critical, play it out and try to survive and try to do your best and embrace it.
Embrace death.
So, to fully exhaust the narrative potential of this sadistic gauntlet run, I highly recommend going into the game in the same way I usually recommend going into The Void, the other game by Icepick Lodge. Start the game as blindly as possible, but approach it with the mentality that you play out your mistakes. Do not try to save spam. Do not try to reach for the best solution, because that doesn't really exist. It's a role-playing, play it out. Expect to fail, but do everything in your power to try and prevent your own failure except, cheesing the game. And Pathologic 2 will be an experience unlike anything you've played before. Failing is not only okay in this game, it's the point. So if you're wondering why this game is so frustrating because your doctor character is not able to take on 5 angry townspeople charging in at you in a knife fight, you've been spoiled by video games, because the answer is right in your question. You're a doctor, you're not a Navy SEAL. The combat is one of the aspects of Pathologic 2 that I saw very often bickered about by game critics as being frustrating and punishment. And it is frustrating and punishment, but as I said, that's the point. I've also read it being described as janky. But as I just said, you are a healer, not a fighter. If you compare this game's fighting mechanics with the original, in which physical confrontations felt like a half-finished Half-Life mod, you can still clearly see the intention behind it. It's meant to be something that costs you dearly. Engaging in a fight was designed to be very likely to hurt you, and every injury needs to be treated, and the material to treat those injuries cost valuable resources that you're already running low on all the time. But in the original, the combat was also very clear-cut and easily learnable, especially if you would save scum. You could quickly find ways to hunt bandits at night without taking any damage at all the time, for instance, and by that, break the economy and always have your pockets filled with money and resources. It was controllable, which sounds good, but it was to the detriment of the actual experience the game intended to get across. While in Pathologic 2, you can sure get better at the fighting and optimize and learn, but its jankiness is designed on purpose. It's not the type of jankiness where it feels like the developers didn't know what they were doing, but the fact that your body feels sluggish, that you feel disorientated by the camera sway when you go into the actual brawl, and especially when you take hits. And also the feeling that when your opponent gets the drop on you, it's very hard and sometimes next to impossible to recover and get back in control over the fight. This is all on purpose. It's supposed to feel nasty. It's supposed to feel like something that is not a joy, something that you don't seek. The game, through loading screens, through tutorials, and through the things characters tell you constantly, really tries to hammer it in that fighting is something that's, as much as you can, supposed to be avoided. This is not a shooter, and this is not a beat-em-up. And you're not a character that's meant to end lives or punch people to pulp, but you're somebody who's supposed to save lives. Such is your skill set, and that's how fighting in this game feels like it's not your nature. After several hours of play, and very likely some unfortunate confrontations that made you end up losing your life and getting punished for it, I naturally became extremely wary of confrontation, in comparison to the original, where I got on top of the confrontations and turned into a Batman at night who just hunted bandits for reputation and money. Here, I tried to avoid being seen at night as much as possible, and only when I got a really good chance of getting in there without being heard, I would take the chance, but it still ends up being something that feels very risky for the reward that you get. Yeah, the fighting, I personally think the way it is solved in this game is fantastic. It goes, as everything, as I keep saying, perfectly in line with the game's central metaphor. Anyway, Pathologic 2 is an exploration of selflessness and selfishness. And it constantly gets you in these situations where you have to take incredibly harsh and painful decisions. But these situations do not arise from a fixed, pre-written script, but they arise from the gameplay directly, from the systems, from the mechanics. And if the developers would have made the game so easy that, you would have a Call of Duty like just enough friction to make you feel mildly challenged, but never too much so you could actually fail, all of this would go straight down the drain. Pathologic 2 is the beauty of disempowerment, perfectly executed, because very few games actually go to the length to explore the complex emotions that lie within failure and shattered hubris. Experience this emotionally firsthand. Like in most games that get the player to make moral choices, it mostly comes from the game putting you straight into a situation where you have to make a choice, a direct binary choice. Like there's often this classical Greek tragedy situations. oh, you can only save one of two people. You have to pick now which one. And that's great stuff, especially when you have to choose in a heartbeat and live with the consequences. But, it's very constructed. It feels very constructed. It feels like somebody wrote that and just laid that in front of you and now pick. You as the player are being led to the choice on rails. And as I said, it's in most cases very binary. But Pathologic 2 is a game that is so finely balanced that these situations, these moments where you have to carefully consider your actions and their consequences, they regularly arise from this intricate pool of interlocking systems, while always being clear enough that you often naturally, through deduction and observation, have a solid grasp on all the ramifications without the game having to spell it out for you. When you're an immortal observer, like in most games, a participant that is telegraphed to be likely fine throughout the rest of the game, there isn't really anything at stake, right? And that makes it hard to truly feel the weight of your decisions. Only when you as a player have everything to gain or lose does this really come into play. It bears the risk of being frustrating, true, but it's also beautiful. Because a moral choice simply gets so much more gravitas if there are actual, real stakes. And those stakes arise organically from what's playing out in front of you and, behind the screen. Organically from the gameplay. And also importantly, are also clearly readable and telegraphed to the player. You need to be able to understand them, not just being blindly bludgeoned over the head. But Pathologic 2 is excellent at that. It makes it feel like your choices are your choices, and not a checkbox in an underlying choose-your-own-adventure that somebody else has pre-written for you. Now, this game does contain quests, in the quite traditional sense, that get triggered by all kinds of events, conversations with people, things happening around you, etc. You get to keep track of them with this beautiful mind map, and with map markers on the map, and you can also look around with like a sort of like an eagle sense to see in which direction your map markers are. So that's quite modern and all rather standard. But the way quests are designed and structured in this game undermines the typical completionist mindset you're taught by the vast majority of video games out there. Like, we're used to, if we get quests, to simply assume that finishing every quest in our list is, of course, a good thing. We're often even conditioned to compulsively hunt for this checkbox-filling behavior. But Pathologic 2 isn't so straightforward there, and often uses this compulsion to turn it on its head. Because first and foremost, it doesn't just want you to blindly run from icon to icon, but it wants you to listen, to understand what's going on here, and then decide if the task at hand is actually worth pursuing, and if your actions in doing so might have a desirable outcome and effect on you and the people involved. Which means that sometimes not finishing a quest is actually the better option. And this will feel backstabby to a lot of people, because we're not used to this. But it's not like the game blindfolds you and pulls you on thin ice and then laughs at you. Because if you end up finishing a quest that will have a negative impact on the world in the end, then you've definitely overlooked a good handful of big red flags that the developers waved right in front of your face. Like, let me give you an example here. If you would like to avoid getting spoiled about an important twist in a quest about 1/3 into the game, that's completely fine. So I'll show you a time code here and you can skip ahead to that and then just miss out on this. So at some point, your friend Lara Ravel will ask you to help her in establishing a shelter for the suffering in her house. And since the running water supply in the town has been destroyed, she asks you to organize one of the big barrels of water that are placed all over town for her endeavor. So you go out and find one of those barrels. But you realize that since water got really sparse and some vandals overnight have spoiled some of the water in the barrels in town, guards have been posted in front of them. So you approach them and talk to them, and they tell you that they first want you to test if the water in the barrels is clean or murky, contaminated. And once you did that, it turns out that the guards with clean water barrels won't, for the love of God, part with them, even for Lara's good cause. Only the guards where it turns out that there's brackish water in the barrels will agree, because they don't need it anymore, and drive the barrel over to Lara's shelter if you agree to that. Now, when I played this just didn't feel right. Why would I send contaminated water over to Lara? But it was a way to end this quest. But I thought there's probably a different solution that I haven't seen, so I decided to decline for now, and since I had more urgent matters at the moment, I took care of some other quests first. And eventually, at the end of the day, I realized that I ran out of time, and in my quest log, the mind map, I got the ominous "some things aren't bound to happen" marker, which feels like I failed. The quest line ended in the conclusion, "I didn't bother with the barrels. Did I make the right choice?" So I talked with some of my friends who also played this game, and I found that some of them actually felt so drawn towards completing the quest that they ended up sending the murky barrels. And that, well, surprise, ended up contaminating the shelter, which means that during the next day, Lara's district and her were infected by the plague. I looked some more into it online, and yes, it's correct. Not finishing this quest is the right choice here. It should seem duh, but the way we're used to quests operating in video games, it simply isn't. It's extraordinary. And there are a good bit more quests like this, where if you just blindly follow the map markers and don't actually pay attention what's going on in front of you and what people are doing and saying, you're going to doom your friends to death. Or maybe that was your agenda all along? Totally viable. It's really up to you. Nobody's stopping you. And this, all this is ultimately why I find this game so genius. Because through its gameplay, it makes you learn so much about yourself. It, really makes you think. So, some of you might have opened Metacritic in another tab and realized that Pathologic 2 only received an around 6.2 average score by game critics, which is something I'd like to discuss a little bit. Because the bigger the medium of video games becomes, the more we hear the argument that video games are art and supposed to be art. Now we can talk for hours about if video games are art, and which video games are supposed to be art and which aren't, and we could go on with shouting at Roger Ebert, but in essence, this argument often goes in really bonkers regions, where the qualifier for what's art and what's not hasn't really anything to do with the claimant's interest in art, but more with excluding something they like from a group they don't. So in that sense, if video games are art, then Pathologic 2 is art, but Frogger and Pac-Man as well as Call of Duty Black Ops 2 are all also art. So game critics, because their job first and foremost is to evaluate games as a consumerist good for validity in a global market economy, with the current state of the video game market, the majority of critics will simply never rate an extremely polarizing game like Pathologic 2 with a 90% or higher score, because it simply won't appeal to everyone. So in principle, there is nothing really wrong with giving this game an objective 70% score, aside from the fact that measuring something highly subjective, such as video games, and an quote-unquote objective numerical score is its very own can of worms. Because if you measure a game like this by broad mass appeal and compare it with the current best-selling titles out there, you'll find that Pathologic 2 fundamentally deviates from the norms these games have put up in 1,000 and more ways. But low review scores don't contradict that. They don't contradict the fact that this game is exceptionally artistic in nature. And that's subjective, but it is. It's a game that tears a leg and arm out to employ the medium it's set into its absolute full potential, to use every tool available to craft a story that's truly impossible to be told in any other medium. And to me personally, this is about the peak of video games as art. It just gets extremely infuriating to see that in many instances, the very same crowd that keeps screaming for video games to please become more art shoots a masterpiece like Pathologic 2 in the groin in review scores because it dares to employ player engagement in an unconventional way to tap into emotions we're not used to challenge during gaming. When that happens, a part of me just sadly withers away and dies. Art, first and foremost, is supposed to make you think things that you don't think every day and feel things that you don't feel every day. Yes, you will feel frustration, hopelessness, and despair when you play the game the way it's intended to be. I've experienced it firsthand, but that's the inherent point here. Pathologic 2 dares to take the player on this journey of hardship, which is breathtaking if you think about the fact that it goes as far as that it can make this horrible plague incident not just audio-visually, but emotionally immersive. It dares to go and explore emotions such as frustration, anger, despair, hopelessness, but explore them and not just merely regard them as something that is to be avoided, something of a negative state that the player should never go into, but it says, what happens if the player goes into it, and what can we learn from that about ourselves and about the story? And that's the beauty of it. It's meant to make you feel things you don't otherwise get to experience. But hey, I also don't want to appear like I'm, gatekeeping. This is not a, if you move the difficulty sliders, you have not only cheated the game, but yourself, blah blah situation. No. I want as many people as possible to experience this game. Obviously, you should also know thyself. There are many different reasons for why this intended experience by the developers might just not work for you personally. And I think Ice Big Launch has addressed that quite well in their statement on difficulty when they released the update that included the adjustable difficulty levels. However, we have received clear feedback that the game is too hard, and we don't think that everyone who says that misses the point of the experience. People are different and have different attention spans and patterns, so we're fine with allowing the players to tweak the game a bit to account for this fact. Our games have always been in a curious spot. Some people only finished the original Pathologic and The Void using cheat codes. And little side note here, the first playthrough of The Void that I ever finished was with the officially released slightly easier mode, and it allowed me to explore the game in a way that I probably wouldn't have been able to otherwise. So yeah, there is a confession. It's valuable. It leads to growth. So while in theory these players agreed with our stance on games as a medium for creating compelling experience, in actuality they didn't really, experience what we had in store for them. Which is, of course, understandable. Not everyone wants a life-changing experience every time they launch a game. Sometimes people only want a cursory glance. Well, we'd rather give people a tweaked experience than none at all. I couldn't agree more with this stance, and I think that this approach by the developers is a wonderful way of addressing the response on the game's steep difficulty and how it was received by many players. Each time you move a slider in the game's settings, you get an estimate on how far you will aberrate from the originally intended experience. But even if you do decide to put the game to absolute baby titty mode, you still get to explore an amazingly crafted, intricate, and stunningly beautiful virtual place. Get the chance to get to know all the characters who you're gonna be intimately familiar with after a while.
What do you call such a man? A slave. You call him a slave.
Yeah, not much to add here. Making it really clear why, if it's possible for players to attempt to play it the way it's meant to be played, while also giving them the option to adjust it to their own preferences if needed. Hell, in the release video of this patch, all the developers almost talked about is how excited they are that you can make the game even harder.
Представьте, мы сейчас дадим игроку возможность вдвое увеличить скорость роста голода, увеличить урон противников, уменьшить эффективность его оружия, его одежды, чтобы страдание достигло просто абсолюта. Ну ладно.
And just another example, I personally know people who, due to, for instance, generalized anxiety disorder, would simply never be able to play this game in its original state without it literally inducing panic attacks, which is definitely not the intended experience. But because the developers delivered the possibility to ease the impact of some of the game's mechanical stressors, it has become approachable for these persons, and they're now adamant fans of the game that, just like me really, never seem to shut up about it. So yeah, the beauty of difficulty, raising the stakes, which might force you to crime and punishment in the doomed city, but without the elitist gatekeeping. Now, this was the main point I wanted to talk about in this video. There are many more aspects about Pathologic 2 that I think are genuinely brilliant. Like the incredibly complex constellation and interrelation of dozens of characters that, Jesus, it took me a long time to even unravel for myself. And you gotta realize that this is a story that has been refined for 1.5 decades by now. Pathologic 2 took the first game almost as a blueprint and built upon it quite effectively. You know, you can take its story just plain literal and you'd already have a good time. Pathologic 2 is an incredible simulation of a deadly plague in an isolated settlement. Signed. But is that really what it's about? If you want it to be, it is. But also, if you want to, you can probably write philosophical, sociological, and political dissertations on the basis of this tale because, man, this game is rich with lore, backstory, history, symbolism, you name it. There is a lot of it, symbolism I mean. And some of it feels quite on the nose, like for instance the city's districts being named after body parts, the spleen, the marrow, the backbone, and the gut. But once you start applying this allegory and start thinking about it, it becomes indefinitely meta. This is very similar to the Void, where the structure of the Void resembled things like uterine imagery and brain synapses. But what does it actually mean? What's the real metaphor here? Is this town really a town, or just an allegory for something? Pathologic 2, as I said, can be read blunt and straight up, or you can start reading into its meta-narrative and get forever lost in a labyrinth of narrative depth. Pathologic 2 is 4D chess of literary video game analysis. And the way the city was designed, rendered, staged, helped the lighting is pretty much always so striking. I just find it so fucking beautiful. And here's the thing. It's so incredibly full with details that bear meaning and supports the game's themes and story. Like I just mentioned the lighting. You've probably noticed the striking close-ups when you engage in conversations, right? Super minimalistic and focused on everything that's necessary at this very moment with no excess garbage. Almost pitch dark background, clear and bright dialogue font, and the character portraits close up and highlighted through dramatically staged lighting. This is that character in the current dialogue being in the spotlight. I said that the whole thing is framed as a theater performance. All the other lights are dimmed right now, the whole theater is dark, and the entire focus is on that actor right now. And the lighting that hits them is deliberate and nuanced, full with detail again. For example, there are 2 different herbal brides you meet in the game, and one is rather reticent in character, the other is more forthcoming, almost assertive. And you can see these differences of character represented in how they carry themselves and how the lighting frames them in dialogue close-ups. This is the case with every character. The spotlight positions, intensities, angles and colors, and objects that obstruct the light to cast shadows on them, they're not just placed randomly or to just look nice, but there's a lot of thought put into how to stage and light each actor to support the character and the role they play. Keep an eye out for that, it's really fascinating. Also, is one of the few games where a smaller character actually looks up to you. Ultimate dad simulator. But yeah, this holistic approach to crafting a game, having every single aspect of its design from mechanics and gameplay systems over visual design, graphics, lighting, sound, voice directing, writing, you name it. Man, even the item descriptions in this game are so deep and tongue-in-cheek it puts a Soulsborne to shame. I love this, because it leaves me room to find my own meaning in it. When you start interpreting games by Icepick Lodge, people will come and tell you, no, wrong analysis. It means this, not what you said. And, well, they're frankly wrong. There is no one meaning behind the story. It's more like a Tarkovsky film, where it's more about metaphors over symbolism. There is no finite meaning to its imagery. It's open for individual reading and interpretation, and that's what makes it so fascinating and enthralling. It's that type of story that you experience once at a certain point in your life, and you pick up on certain things and read something into it, and then you come back to it maybe several years later as a slightly or vastly different person. You know, you might have grown a little bit personally in the meantime, and you suddenly find completely different things in it that matter to you, and suddenly the whole game starts meaning something completely different. And all of these interpretations of you and of other people are completely valid. I don't know, there's only a handful of stories, no matter if it's film, literature, or video games, that worked quite like this for me. And Pathologic 1 was definitely one of them, just like The Void was. Like, my video on The Void in some ways offered a probably rather unique reading on the game in parts, and I found it super exciting and humbling after I released it to actually have the people from Icepick Lodge reach out to me, and they told me that they really enjoyed my personal reading of the game because they've never quite looked at it from this exact angle, but that it ultimately made them also look at their own work from a completely different perspective and even learn something about themselves, kind of. And it was completely valid as an interpretation. And well, Pathologic 2 is once again exactly this type of storytelling all over again. Just seriously on a scale that blows the roof off. I saw an interview with the devs where someone said that if you want to play Tarkovsky's Stalker as a video game, this is a good place to go for. And I couldn't agree more. I used to think that back when I played the original. There was just something about this confined space in which the laws of nature are strangely subverted and varying ideologies and philosophies approach the problem, this extraordinary situation people are exposed to in different ways, in their own ways, and none of which is the right way, but each of which leads to different results and thoughts and solutions that are fascinating to observe and study and think about. People can discuss for decades and still not come to a fixed conclusion. The fact that this here, though, is a game, it turns this experience into an extremely introspective journey for yourself, because you're the one who does it. You're not just observing. And well, the harsh reality of survival is the catalyst to unlock lizard brain responses from you, the player. It's like holding a dark mirror in front of you. It's so chock full of story, lore, meta-narrative, and meaning that, as I've said, I've been biting my nails over it for years to write a comprehensive analysis/interpretation on it, and nothing even felt close to satisfying or making it justice for myself. I'll get there. I hope. I want to. So, let's wrap things up. You might have noticed that in the first game I mentioned that you play one of 3 different characters. The Bachelor, an outsider medical student who approaches the plague and deals with the town with a very scientific academic standpoint. The Haruspex, a surgeon and herbalist who was brought up and educated in the traditions and lore of the indigenous steppe folk. And the Changeling who can... No, I won't unveil it here and now what she can do. Clara is just Clara. You'll have to find that out for yourself. Whereas in Pathologic 2, you apparently only play as the Haruspex. Well, this is because Icepick Lodge at a certain point in development decided to release the 3 playable characters piece by piece, episodically, with the Haruspex being the first. As far as I'm aware, this was in big parts a financial decision of a small studio because they dearly needed revenue from sales to keep going with the production of the game. At first, I was also a little bit confused that it was the Haruspex that was chosen to be released first, because Pathologic 1 used to strongly nudge the players towards starting with The Bachelor. And it is, if you think about it, the most logical approach from a storytelling perspective. Playing an outsider of the town first makes exposition to a newcomer much easier, you know? The more I thought about it, the more I liked the decision, because in my personal opinion, I feel Atemi-Burach actually makes for a much more intriguing and engaging first playthrough, thematically. I can't go that much into details, but I can safely say that when playing Pathologic 1, it was actually during the Haruspex's playthrough, getting to know the town through his lens as someone who grew up here and who's known to the locals and has direct ties to the families and all that, that made me both warm up as well as get far more deeply acquainted with the whole constellation, much more so than during the Bachelor's playthrough. And also, Dankovsky is kind of a prick. But he's a prick that I'm actually really excited to play at some point. Like, I find it far more enthralling to get to know this cocky bastard from an outsider's perspective, to have him grind your gears and patronize you repetitively, and then play him yourself. I also think it says a lot about how great Icepick Lodge are at character writing, that you have this guy who pretty much everyone agrees is a total dipshit, but also pretty much everyone I know adores him, somehow. I don't know, he's just an acquired taste. Just like the whole game, really. But yeah, I think releasing the characters in this order is a fantastic choice.
Look, there will be a happy ending. You'll even believe that you won. No guilty conscience either. So relax, man of fate.
And on that note, Trotsky Murder Weapon Lodge did a fantastic job with this first part already. Playing through the Haruspex's viewpoint of the sand pest incident will already take you 25 to 40 hours as an estimate. And that is for one playthrough. And I can tell you that I rarely had a game that I finished once and I couldn't wait to directly start another playthrough to see how it would unfold differently with the things that I've learned and how to improve it. I don't know, there's just something that just pulled me right back. So at a price tag of around $35, you will already get your money's worth. Plus, you have the knowledge that the devs are working on 2 more unique storylines that are going to be released in the future, which will enrich the game beyond measure in the near future. So if any of this piqued your interest for the game and you can afford it, please consider supporting Icepick Lodge because I really want this studio to stay afloat. Not only because I want the game to be finished at some point for, my own enjoyment, but also they damn well deserve it. And just for clarity, despite me gushing here without filter for the entirety of this video that is already God knows how long, this is not a sponsored video. I really just want people to not miss out on it. I really just love this game and the developer. And now, so finally, in case you are someone who has decided that you have not played Pathologic 1 yet, but you are firmly set that you want to experience the first one before starting number 2. Definitely go for the Pathologic Classic HD version that's available on GOG and Steam, because that's the best version of the game you can get. But I also like to offer an alternative, in case you want to experience the story without necessarily having to bite your way through, months of learning the harsh reality of its gameplay and systems. I highly recommend you Sul Matul's channel, on which he has a playthrough of the entire game. He's one of the YouTubers out there that is known for his extensive coverage of Pathologic, as well as its sequel, and I can only say that his commentary in his complete playthrough of all 3 characters of Pathologic 1 is extremely enjoyable. Seriously, it's one of my favorite Let's Plays on the entirety of YouTube. It is chill and pleasant to listen to, but it's also full of background knowledge about the game by someone who played this game obviously for many years, but without littering you with information out of nowhere, but he organically discovers the game with you, with the viewer. He's asking the right questions at the right time. It's really enjoyable to watch, and fittingly, I think he's actually the Doctor in real life, so that's probably one of the most ideal Pathologic experiences you can get. He also made a couple of really good long-form video essays on Pathologic, The Void, and Pathologic 2, jealous there that you already completed them, as well as a really helpful spoiler-free newbie guide on how to approach Pathologic 2, which I can also recommend looking into before you play the second one to give you a little bit of a primer. But alright, is there anything that I've missed? Heck yeah, there's a lot that I've missed. There's so much more I want to talk about Pathologic-wise, but in this video, as I said, I only wanted to cover the main reasons for me why I think this game is absolutely fricktastic and you should play it. I'm gonna end this largely unscripted video here and let you decide if you want to try it out for yourself. Do you have any questions? Feel free to ask in the comments. I'd love to discuss the game with you, and you'll probably find some ardent fans rushing to help right away. Because that's really also one of the things that I've noticed with Pathologic and Pathologic 2 as well. Those who grew to love this game simply can't shut up and keep chewing people's ears off about it. Evidently.